I'm going to be presenting COVID and global changes. Environmental change is one of the biggest and most vital challenges of the 21st century. In spite of all of humanity's efforts to restore nature during the last few decades, not much has changed. However, as the world stepped foot into quarantine these past few months, a large amount of the environment has recovered, sending a positive impact on global climate change. Despite this large change during the quarantine, it seems that only a few months after the start of the pandemic recovery, climate change has begun to build up. Storms, floods, and droughts are among the most apparent resources for disruption under the pandemic. But not only is the weather heating up, so is the amount of inorganic matter piling up in homes and on beaches. As a result of the pandemic, countries like the USA and Australia have stopped recycling programs in hopes that it will stop the spread and risk of COVID-19. In the USA and in some European nations, most companies have ceased their recyclable programs, meaning that these companies are bringing back single-use disposable items and packaging. This has caused a buildup of trash and even medical waste that is posing a huge threat to marine life and wildlife habitats. For example, in China, the source of this pandemic and probably one of the countries who has been hit the hardest, discarded face masks are being found by the heaps on beaches and in nature trails. Another problem, not only in the US but in other countries as well, is the disregard for sewage cleanup. In the Netherlands, a study showed that the COVID-19 virus was detected in 6 cities' sewage sites. A study was then conducted, and it was found that people with the COVID-19 in their gastrointestinal tract will excrete the disease in their feces and thus can spread the virus through the sewage water. Since these findings have been made, the affected countries have been using a waste-based epidemiology approach to control the affected sewage waters in hopes to prevent further spread of the coronavirus. Environmental issues have not been the only issue that people have been taking notice since the pandemic hit. The importance of water quality has also become something to watch out for. The Earth might seem like it has abundant water, but in fact it has less than 1% available for human use. While population and demand on freshwater resources are increasing, supply will always remain constant. In order to maintain this consistency, the water cycle continuously returns water to the Earth, and it enables the availability of water for all living organisms and regulates weather patterns on our planet. If water didn't naturally recycle itself, we would run out of clean water, which is essential for life. Keeping this in mind, the coronavirus has pushed the pause button on industries around the world, and with more people staying at home, running the dishwasher more, and doing extra loads of laundry, what has that meant for the water usage and, for more importantly, our water quality? Interestingly, our commercial and industrial water demand is going down. It may turn out that during this pandemic crisis, the total demand for water may go down as the economy starts to begin the recovery process. So, despite doing a few extra loads of laundry during the week, the amount of water overall being used is still minimal. On another note, waterways have been seen being less and less used as this pandemic surges onwards. In some places like Venice, the low water traffic has led to an increased transparency of the water canals, letting all of the residents see the marine life below. Other places around the world are seeing signs of positive change in their water quality as well. India, for example, is heavily populated and the people tend to bathe and have ritualistic burnings of loved ones within their water systems. After the declaration of the lockdown due to COVID-19, however, quality of water in rivers have started giving a positive sign towards restoring. In fact, a group of researchers studying Vembanad Lake, the longest freshwater lake in India, found that the pollution in the water decreased by 15.9% on average. The only decrease in water quality that has been thus far recorded is in Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon. Here, they pre-COVID already have poor access to clean water and sanitation, which are key elements in fighting against such a virus as mighty as COVID-19. This unsanitary water supply is a cause of concern and required immediate remediation to avoid any large outbreaks of the disease in the camps and hosting communities. Finally, the most impacted factor from the pandemic lockdown has been the most studied is emissions and air pollutants. Before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, emissions of carbon dioxide were rising about 1% per year over the previous decade. Renewable energy production was expanding rapidly, but much of the renewable energy did not replace fossil energy, and emissions from surface transportation and continued to rise. Despite this yearly incline of carbon emissions, due to the global shutdown and everyone forced to stay home and virtually most jobs ceasing, the pandemic seems to have had the opposite effect. During quarantine, roughly around February to June, it was estimated that global emissions declined by as much as 30%. Additionally, it was found that in May 2020, that because of the intense decrease in emissions and air pollutants, it is now predicted that the annual carbon emissions will now have a decline of up to 7%. This would be the biggest drop since World War II, according to the researchers. They ascribe these decreases mainly to the reduction of transportation usage in industrial activities. Another study conducted by researchers showed that regionally decreases in emissions in China were the largest and occurred the earliest, followed by Europe and then the US. Overall, the International Energy Agency estimates by the end of 2020 about 2.6 billion tons of carbon will not be added to our atmosphere. Currently, during the start of the COVID recovery period, carbon emissions are still being seen as decreasing. This is mainly due to worldwide distance education and the decrease of social mobility. Social mobility causes many carbon emissions and is mainly involved in student services. In addition to the decrease of social mobility, scientific events, meetings, and political events have started to be held in form of remote conference. This over has caused environmental emissions to decrease globally. Using the website IMPLAN, the original data was able to be collected. IMPLAN is an online database based on input-output models and is updated yearly. IMPLAN consists of 546 industries, 5 which were unused in the data calculations. With the remaining 541 industries, data was collected into an Excel sheet from the year 2008 until 2018. From there, the predicted emissions of different greenhouse gases per dollar output were calculated and then converted in terms of the equivalent emission of CO2. From the collected 2018 data, predictions for the 2019-2020 COVID era were created. Once all of the data was collected, the top 5 industries were found and the greenhouse gas emission trends were recorded. These top 5 industries include beef cattle ranching and farming, air transportation, grain farming, electric power generation or hydroelectric, and dairy cattle and milk production. If you take a look to the right, an image of some of the other industries we found through the use of IMPLAN are represented. Also, a snippet of some of the pre-COVID data for the industry can be seen. This pre-COVID data was used in helping predict the COVID data that was used in finding the results in some of the charts that I will continue to review on the next few slides. In regards to Figure 1, it can be seen that the air transportation produced the most greenhouse gas emissions in all of the collected years under study. A jump from 2012 to 2014 can be seen as the greenhouse gas emissions rose and then continues to remain at a steady high of 2 times 10 to the 13th CO2 released per year. However, due to COVID, an immense drop in CO2 emissions were seen. This is probably due to the worldwide quarantine at the start of the 2020 year, where all transportation was halted. As mentioned before quarantine, roughly February to June 2020, it was estimated that the global emissions declined as much as 30%. This high decrease in greenhouse gas emissions could have a large deal with the decreased transportation. On the other hand, when you take a look at the hydroelectric power generation, which is out of the 5 leading industries, it was seen to have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions rate per year. In this graph, it is depicted to release the same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere at about 5 times 10 to the 10th. And even when COVID was on the rise, the emission rate remained the same. As a result of the strict quality and emissions, separate graphs were made to more closely examine the results of greenhouse gas emission rates for both air transportation and hydroelectric power generation, which will be seen on the next few slides. Taking a look at Figure 2, which represents all of the data for air transportation, it can more closely be seen that, although the emission rates were still significantly high, the patterns are a bit different than first inspected. The emissions in 2012 did show a spike like before, however, in 2014 the rates seemed to drop greatly again. And then, when looking at the 2018 data, a giant spike in emissions can be found. When looking at the COVID year, it can be seen that the emission rates were cut in half and then some, dropping to about 1.5 times 10 to the 11th in 2018, to about 5 times 10 to the 10th during COVID. In regards to which discusses hydroelectric power generation, it can be seen that the greenhouse gas emission rates look quite different than what was originally represented in Figure 1. In fact, it looks very similar to the same trends that can be seen in Figure 2, discussing air transportation. Like Figure 2, a large spike in greenhouse gas emissions were seen in 2018 and then cut in about half when COVID hit. While we might have held environmental issues, water quality problems, and a high rate of air pollution and emissions in regard to global warming before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it is only after this great pandemic a real change has been seen. While there be environmental conditions such as an increase in organic waste pollution, improved water qualities due to unused waterways, or improved air pollution and carbon emissions, our world is going to continue to change due to this virus. From this research, I was able to conclude that a large drop in emissions rates was actually seen in many of our top greenhouse gas emitter industries. Along with seeing the trends in decreased social activity via quarantine, with not as many people actively traveling around the world or leaving their home, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions is seen to have largely decreased. Despite quarantine being long over, the COVID 19 virus surges on, leading to stay at home trends to continue. As we resume these stay at home trends and emission rates will carry on, more significant changes to our environment will start to be seen and affect the years to come. Maybe because of COVID, the decreased greenhouse gas emissions will be able to lead us away from our tragic global warming end. This has been COVID and Global Changes. Thanks for watching and stay safe.